Hey there! Tonight we're wandering back in time, but not to the knights and castles, and courtly love stories people like to romanticize. No, we're slipping through the quieter corners of medieval Europe, into the narrow in-between spaces, the kitchen's cloisters and back doors where whispers had power, and silence was survival. The kind of history that isn't etched in marble, but breathed between women in the dark. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to live in a world where simply smiling too brightly could be seen as a warning sign, well, this might be a story for you. We'll walk slowly, talk softly, and look carefully at the spaces between what's written and what's remembered. And only if you'd like to feel free to leave a quiet comment below. Maybe share where you think you'd have stood in a world like this. Would you have blended in? Or would your light have made others uneasy? So come closer. Wrap the blanket tighter. Let's begin where most trouble did in the early morning, when rumors were fresh and the world was watching. The streets are still asleep when you open your eyes. A thin mist clings to the cobblestones, and outside your window a rooster calls once half-heartedly, as if reluctant to wake the world. The sky hasn't made up its mind yet, still unsure whether it wants to be night or day. You rise slowly, blanket draped around your shoulders, and step onto the cold stone floor of your small room. Somewhere nearby, buckets clatter, and a soft murmur carries through the alley. The baker's wife again, probably. Always the first to know and the last to forget. You slip outside into the courtyard, breath misting in the cold. The stone feels damp beneath your feet, and the wind carries voices not meant for you. At first you think it's just the usual chatter, bread prices, weather complaints, a chicken that refuses to lay. But then you hear it again, clearer now, the baker's niece. She smiled too brightly at a visiting friar. That's it, just a smile. But already the story has taken root and begun to twist. Someone says her cheeks were flushed. Another adds that her eyes looked glassy. One woman swears the friar stammered after speaking with her. And so the seed of suspicion is planted, watered with morning gossip, and left to bloom into accusation. It's not the first time, of course. You've heard stories like this before. A girl glances the wrong way, laughs too loudly, speaks too freely, and suddenly she's no longer a neighbor, but a risk. There's no law that forbids warmth, no decree that bans curiosity. And yet here in this world, those things are dangerous. They signal something deeper, something feared. Because when a woman looks like she knows something, especially something about herself, people begin to worry. Historically, many medieval towns, especially in Central and Western Europe, were tightly knit and closely watched. Morality wasn't just a private matter. It was a public concern. The church didn't need to be present in every street, because its gaze had already seeped into the fabric of daily life. It lived in neighbors' eyes, in mothers' warnings, in the careful way girls learned to lower their gaze by the time they were 10. One documented custom from medieval Flanders tells us that if a girl was seen laughing alone in the presence of a man, particularly someone of the clergy or upper rank, she could be summoned before the parish elders for questioning. There didn't need to be a crime. Just unseemly conduct, as they called it. A term so vague it could fit anything that made someone uncomfortable. A blush, a hairpin placed too carefully, a voice that lingered on a vowel. You think back to the baker's niece. She's hardly more than 17. Quiet, polite, quick with her hands. You've seen her kneading dough in the early hours, her face flushed from the oven, her hair escaping the edge of her coif. She is by every measure a good girl. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe it never is. There's an old saying passed from woman to woman in your village, what's unspoken is safest. You heard it first from your aunt, who whispered it while sewing a hem. She said it like a lullaby, like a secret. And you carry it now like a charm. Because here, truth isn't about facts. It's about timing power and perception. And those things can shift faster than the weather. You walk past a group of women gathering water, Their voices hush as you approach. One of them smiles narrow, cautious, and nods toward the well. You take your place in line and pretend not to hear the quiet repetition of the friar story as it grows its new branches. Now someone says he was bewitched. Another swears she saw the girl slip something into her sleeve. The story has begun its transformation from smile to temptation to sorcery. You know how this ends. You've seen it before. What's most chilling is how normal it feels. No torches, no trials, just murmurs, shrugs, raised brows. The machinery of fear doesn't need to shout. It whispers, and those whispers cling sticking to woolen sleeves and wooden doors carried on the wind like smoke. Historians still debate just how repressive daily life was for women in the Middle Ages. Some argue that while the Church's official stance was harsh, actual enforcement varied. Rural communities, they say, had more flexibility, more room for personal agency. Others insist that even in villages, the social codes, though unwritten, were ruthlessly clear. Step outside them and you wouldn't need a trial. Just silence exclusion or a ruined name. There's a curious tidbit tucked in a 13th century French parish record. It tells of a girl accused of tempting a monk simply because she brushed flour from his sleeve. She wasn't punished officially, but within a week her family's bread stall had no buyers. By harvest season they had relocated. No sentence had been passed, but a verdict had been reached. You draw your shawl closer. Around you the morning stirs to life. Horses clip past. Doors creak open. A dog barks lazily from under a cart. It would all seem peaceful if not for the weight in your chest, the sense that every step, every gesture must be measured. It's not just about this girl, this smile. It's about all the smiles before hers. All the women who laughed too freely, stood too tall, or dared to glow just a little. They live on in the caution etched into your movements. You learn their stories not from books, but from the space between glances, from what the elders wouldn't say out loud. And still, despite it all, women continued to smile, carefully, cautiously, beautifully. Maybe because they didn't want to forget how. Maybe because holding that light, however quietly, was its own kind of rebellion. As the sun finally begins to rise over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the road, you step away from the gossip, the glances, the slow-blooming rumor. You don't speak. You don't need to. The silence is already doing enough. The church bell chimes faintly in the distance, though no one seems to mark the time by it anymore. Its sound is not a signal, but a habit, something that passes through the air and sinks into the stones uninvited, but ever present. You cross yourself out of instinct, as everyone does even when alone. It's not so much belief as reflex, not so much reverence as routine. Because here in this world, piety is not only a virtue, it is protection. You walk toward the chapel skirts, brushing against the low wildflowers growing between cracks in the road. The building looms quiet, gray-cold, even under the rising sun. And as you near the wooden doors, you feel it again, that strange sensation that you're not being watched by people, but by ideas, by invisible laws carved not in stone, but in the softness of behavior. You hesitate before entering, as if the weight of your thoughts might set off some unseen alarm. Then you step inside. The air is cool, tinged with wax and mildew. Candles flicker. Stone arches curve overhead like ribs. And at the altar a priest kneels with bowed head. You sit quietly on a back bench, the wood worn smooth by generations of shifting knees. And you listen not to the man, not to the words, but to the undercurrent, the tone, the shape of what's being said. He speaks of purity today, of virtue, of the fragility of the soul and the dangers of temptation. He does not name names. He doesn't need to. The lesson isn't for sinners. It's for everyone. It's to remind you that your body is not just yours, it's a field where spiritual battles are fought, and every gesture, every blush, every breath might be ammunition for the wrong side. This wasn't unusual in medieval sermons. Many were less about salvation than surveillance. Female virtue especially was often compared to delicate objects, glass milk snow things easily stained, irreparably damaged. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine wrote treatises, warning that even within marriage pleasure was dangerous. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most revered theologians of the time, argued that women's desire was inherently more carnal, more corruptible, and thus more threatening to the spiritual order. And that belief didn't just remain in the pulpit. It filtered into law, into medicine, into the quiet mutterings of everyday life. A woman's body was seen as both vessel and threat. She could carry life, yes, but also sin, illness, chaos. Her feelings weren't just personal. They were suspicious. There was a medical theory popular during the 12th and 13th centuries in parts of Europe that claimed a woman's womb could wander throughout the body if she experienced unchecked desire or failed to reproduce. This so-called wandering womb was blamed for hysteria, fainting, and even possession. The treatment: cold compresses, restrictive diets, and sometimes disturbingly rituals meant to drive the womb back into place. You sit in the back pew absorbing the rhythm of the sermon. You've heard this before. The words shift slightly each time, but the shape remains the same. Be still, be small, be silent. The most holy woman is the quiet one, the obedient one, the invisible one. Outside the church, the sun has lifted higher, and the market is beginning to stir. You walk slowly past stalls being assembled, crates, creaking hands busy with the day's labor. But even here the sermon echoes. A girl adjusts her veil as she walks, eyes down. A wife pulls her shawl tighter when a group of men passes. A mother holds her daughter's wrist a moment too long, a silent reminder to watch herself. It's not just about rules. It's about the way those rules nestle into the bones of daily life. They become posture. They become tone. They become the habit of moving through the world as if always apologizing for existing. And what's most tragic, perhaps, is how normalized it feels. You wouldn't call it fear, not exactly. It's something quieter, duller. Like walking on ice you've always known might crack. Like breathing carefully so as not to disturb the dust. Historians still argue how universally this theology shaped real women's lives. In some places, especially among the rural poor, survival often took precedence over spiritual doctrine. A woman's usefulness could outweigh her perceived sin. But in wealthier towns under closer clerical watch, the moral codes were stricter and often crueler, especially when it came to anything that resembled confidence or joy. One strange tidbit comes from a 14th century Flemish record. A young woman was accused of public vanity because she wore green ribbons in her hair too often. The color was considered flirtatious. And when asked why she wore them, she said they made her feel happy. The court fined her for encouraging unchaste thoughts in others. She was 16. You pause under an awning watching two girls chase each other through the alley, giggling. They can't be older than 8. Their laughter bounces off the stones unchecked, unjudged for now. But you wonder how long they have before that joy becomes suspect. Before someone tells them to smile. Less, speak less, be less. Back in your childhood, you remember your aunt again. She once told you that every woman carries a shadow stitched into her hem. It keeps you grounded, she said, but it also trips you when you try to run. You didn't understand then. You do now. You glance at your own reflection in a puddle. Your face looks softer than it feels. Your mouth is a line, your shoulders slightly curled. Not because of fatigue, but because you've learned over time that quiet curves survive longer than sharp corners. As you step back into the road, a group of young men laughs nearby. One of them looks your way. You instinctively glance down, not out of shame, but strategy. Because even now, even here in this moment, you know a look can become a story. A story can become suspicion, and suspicion can become sentence. The bell tolls again, louder this time, calling the town to midday prayers. But for you, it's not a summons, it's a warning. That sound echoing through the village is not just about worship. It's about watching, listening, remembering your place. And so you keep walking. Head slightly bowed pace, even eyes calm. Not because you're afraid, not exactly, but because you know how fragile safety is, and how easily it slips through your fingers if you don't hold it with both hands. You turn down a quieter street now, one where the stones feel warmer beneath your feet, and the wind is less harsh. The chapel bell fades into the distance, replaced by softer sounds, wooden spoons against iron pots, the swish of laundry in buckets, hens clucking to one another, as if they too are passing on news. This is where the women gather behind homes near the wells, under shaded awnings strung with drying herbs. There's no formal meeting, no schedule, just presence. They lean in toward each other while hands stay busy, kneading dough, mending sleeves, rinsing linens, always doing, always listening. And when you draw near, you begin to hear it, the instructions. They're never given like orders. That would be too obvious, too rigid. No, they come as murmurs, as half sentences you're expected to understand, without needing the rest. Don't linger when you speak. Keep your hands folded. If he looks at you too long, walk away first. These are not rules of etiquette. These are survival codes passed from mother to daughter, like heirloom recipes no one dares write down. You remember your own mother's version. It came while brushing your hair. Finger's gentle voice, softer still. Always smile with your lips, not your eyes, she'd said. And never laugh if you don't know who's watching. At the time, you thought it strange. Later, you realized it was armor. Medieval households, especially those of the working class, were often multi-generational. Women raised girls in close quarters, teaching not just how to sew or cook, but how to navigate a world where their intentions were rarely believed, and their actions always read between the lines. What passed as wisdom was in fact preparation, how to survive attention, how to avoid attention, how to vanish just enough to stay safe. You sit beside a cluster of women at a wooden bench as they sort vegetables for stew. One of them, a midwife, is telling a story about her cousin's daughter, who laughed too freely during the festival season. He only asked if she wanted honeyed wine, she says, voice low. But her laugh made it seem like an invitation. Now people talk. The others nod, but no one interrupts. They've heard this pattern before. Historians still argue whether these instructions were universally taught, or more dependent on class and region. In some remote areas, community cohesion allowed for more tolerance, even pockets of female leadership. But in towns closely tied to church oversight, social scripts were strict. One misstep could lead not only to gossip, but exclusion or worse. And it wasn't just what you did, it was what you wore, how you carried yourself, where you stood. In certain parts of 14th century England, unmarried women were required to wear distinctive head coverings during church festivals. It marked them as available, but also placed them under scrutiny. If you appeared too proud, too confident, the assumption wasn't strength, it was danger. There's a peculiar entry in a parish ledger from Norfolk that records a girl being scolded publicly for lacing her bodice too tightly. The priest called it tempting the devil's eye. The girl was 12. You rise from the bench, hands slightly numb from sitting too long. As you stretch, you hear another woman whisper to her daughter, "Never be the first to speak or the last to leave." The girl nods solemnly. She's maybe 10, already learning the choreography of disappearing just enough. A few steps away, a young woman with flushed cheeks asks her aunt how to tell if a man's interest is honest or not. The older woman pauses, then replies, "If he looks at you when no one else does, he's lying. If he looks at you when everyone else is watching, he's foolish." Either way, walk slower. It almost sounds poetic, but you know it's not meant as verse. It's a kind of code of verbal talisman against a world that punishes even the smallest misread signal. Because here, liking someone or being liked can't be simple. It's layered with suspicion, with interpretation, with consequences that unfold behind closed doors. You remember once in your 15th year you dared to write a line of verse on a scrap of parchment. He spoke kindly, and I forgot to blink. You hid it under your mattress for 3 days. Before burning it in the hearth, terrified someone might find it and assume too much. Not because it was improper, but because it was honest. And honesty, especially about desire, is too sharp-edged for this world. You pass by a laundry line and catch sight of a girl checking her reflection in a pot lid. She tilts her head slightly, then quickly looks away ashamed. In some towns, even carrying a mirror was suspect. One old superstition claimed that frequent self-admiration could invite unclean spirits. It sounds absurd now, but in a place where fear cloaks itself in rules, absurdity often gains power. The tidbit floats to mind in several parts of 13th century northern Italy. Young women were advised not to wear red ribbon unless they were betrothed, as the color was thought to draw the eye of lust. One girl who continued to wear red was accused of leading a local boy into temptation, despite his being 7 years her senior and already married. You turn a corner and spot a girl you know, Eleanor, kneeling beside a basket of herbs. She's maybe 16, maybe younger, but her posture is practiced cautious. You watch the way she lowers her eyes when a merchant passes, the way she pulls her sleeves down over her wrists. Someone taught her this. Maybe her mother, maybe a neighbor, maybe life itself. You think about all the lessons you've absorbed without realizing. How to fold your arms just so. How to laugh quietly. How to answer questions without sounding too eager. They weren't in any book. They didn't come from the pulpit. But they are rules all the same, passed hand to hand like prayer beads. The sky is beginning to shift, now blue, deepening at the edges. Smoke rises from chimneys, thin and fragrant. Supper's not far off. You pause at the well, draw a small bucket, and wash your hands, slowly watching the water darken as it hits the stones. You think of the stories whispered around you today, some funny, some sharp, all warnings in disguise. As the final light of day slips behind the rooftops, you understand something. These instructions, these inherited silences, are not just about avoiding punishment. They are about carving out space in a world that would rather you take up none at all. And so you fold them into yourself, these words, these looks, these lessons, and walk home through the twilight, armed not with weapons but with awareness. You make your way back toward the center of the village, where the air feels heavier and the houses crowd closer together. The midday sun filters through lattice windows and smoke-dusted shutters, casting golden lines across the dirt path. There's a quiet tension in the stillness, as if the walls themselves are listening, waiting, bracing for what comes next. You know this road well. Everyone does. Because at the end of it lies not a market or a chapel, but something more intimate and more public. A wedding. They say it's a joyous event, a binding of souls, a celebration of family. But today, as you approach the low-ceilinged house, strung with dried lavender and pine boughs, it feels more like theater. And you are not here for the music or the bread or the shy smiles exchanged across the hearth. You are here for the bedding. You keep your steps soft, your eyes lowered. Inside, people mill about awkwardly. The bride, barely 17, sits stiffly on a carved wooden bench, her gown simple but spotless. Her mother clutches a small cloth bundle, delicate linen meant not for comfort but for proof. Because here a marriage isn't truly real until something is blood-stained and shown. There is no formal law that requires it. And yet in many towns across medieval Europe, the expectation is as solid as the stones beneath your feet. After the ceremony, the newlyweds are led to a bed, sometimes cheered on, sometimes solemnly watched. and by morning the linen is displayed for all to see. A mark of honor, they say. A mark of truth. You take a seat on the edge of the gathering, careful not to meet too many eyes. The bride's face is pale, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The groom, older by at least a decade, speaks too loudly, as if to fill the silence she cannot. Around them, guests drink watered wine and speak of the weather, pretending not to notice the tension threading through the room. There's a saying in your village, a woman marries her future and her judge on the same day. You never liked it. But standing here now, watching the quiet stagecraft unfold, you see the truth in it. Historically, the practice of displaying bloodied sheets after the wedding night was particularly prevalent in some French, German, and Eastern European regions, especially among the nobility and upper merchant classes. It served both as confirmation of consummation and a symbol of the bride's value rooted in the deeply embedded belief that virginity equated to purity, and purity equated to worth. Of course, biology didn't always cooperate, but that didn't matter. If the evidence didn't appear, suspicion did. Some families, desperate to avoid shame, kept vials of sheep's blood on hand just in case. Others trained their daughters to prick their fingers discreetly should nature not oblige. It was theater, yes, but dangerous theater where the wrong scene could unravel a life. You glance toward the door where a servant girl peeks in eyes wide. She's probably the one tasked with watching the room tonight, or perhaps the one assigned to carry the linens come morning. In some households, witnesses were stationed just outside the wedding chamber, close enough to hear far enough to pretend not to listen. Their job was not compassion. It was confirmation. One tidbit tucked into a 15th century Hungarian household manual advises newlyweds to shout once or twice so the neighbors might sleep well. Not for joy, but to ensure no one could claim things were left unfinished. The bride stands now led by her mother and two older women down a narrow corridor. She does not speak. The room falls silent. The groom follows expression unreadable. The door closes behind them. And still the guests remain. Not out of rudeness, but duty. Because in many parts of medieval society, the consummation of a marriage wasn't just expected. It was considered part of the social contract. A family's honor, a woman's legitimacy, a man's pride, all bound up in what happened or didn't happen behind that wooden door. Historians still debate how widespread this practice truly was. Some argue it was more symbolic than literal, especially outside the upper classes. Others believe the pressure was very real, especially in towns where reputation could dictate survival. What is clear is that even the suggestion of improper conduct could lead to annulment, disgrace, or worse. You shift on your bench, the wood groaning beneath you. Around you, guests whisper in polite tones. Someone offers you a piece of bread. You accept, though you don't eat. The taste of anxiety is already thick on your tongue. You remember another wedding years ago when the bride's sheets came back clean. Her mother wept. Her husband shouted. The midwife tried to explain that not every woman bled, but no one believed her. By the week's end, the girl had been sent back to her parents. They said it was annulled. They didn't say what became of her. In one record from 14th century Saxony, a young wife who failed to produce the expected proof was brought before the village council. Her father claimed the groom was at fault. The groom claimed deceit. A priest intervened, suggesting that perhaps the girl was cursed or overly eager in her thoughts. She was sent to a convent. The groom remarried. You look around the room. Most of the guests are smiling now, politely, stiffly. They raise cups and share stories, as if this is all normal. And in many ways it is. That's what makes it more chilling. The cruelty is not hidden. It's ritualized. You think again of your mother. On the night before your cousin's wedding, she gave you a piece of cloth, not embroidered, not dyed, just plain linen. This is what matters, she said. Not the dress, not the feast. This. She didn't need to explain. You understood. Every girl does. It's getting darker now. Lamps are being lit. A gentle knock at the door breaks the hush, and the mother reappears, holding the folded linen in both hands. There is a mark. That is enough. She nods. The room exhales. Someone claps. The groom reappears smug and satisfied. The bride trails behind, face unreadable. The cloth is displayed briefly, then folded again, tucked away like a relic. No one says anything unkind. No one says anything at all. But the message is clear, the test is passed. The performance is complete. You step outside needing air. The evening is crisp scented with smoke and chamomile. A child runs past you laughing. Somewhere a dog barks. Life continues as it always does. But you carry the weight of what you've seen not just tonight, but all the nights like it. Because in this world a woman is not trusted by her voice, her character, her kindness, but by the condition of a sheet. And still they smile. Still they show up. Still they endure. Not because they're weak, but because they know what's at stake if they don't. And perhaps that's the strongest thing of all. The village is quiet the next morning, but not because people are sleeping. In a place like this, peace often signals something else. Something watched, measured waiting. You step outside shawl drawn close, and feel the chill of a silence too careful, the kind that clings to corners and slides beneath doors. And today it lingers near the widow's house. She lives just 3 doors down alone now for nearly 2 years. Her husband died of a winter fever, and ever since her garden has grown too wild, her cheeks too pink, her eyes too direct. That's what they say at least. You've heard it before. She doesn't lower her gaze quickly enough. She doesn't rush through the market like she should. She speaks plainly when spoken to, and worst of all, she smiles. There's a woman at the well murmuring that the widow spent too long speaking to the miller's boy yesterday. Another says she's taken to reading again. Something about herbs, they think. Perhaps a prayer book. Perhaps something darker. No one says the word aloud yet, but you can feel it circling danger. Not because of anything she's done, but because of what she no longer has a man beside her. In medieval society, a woman without male protection was an anomaly. Widows were expected to mourn quietly, remarry quickly, or retreat into a life of subdued piety. Independence, especially in public, invited scrutiny. And if that independence came with wit confidence, or heaven forbid beauty, it wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as a problem. In many medieval towns, widows occupied a precarious legal space. While some enjoyed certain rights, such as managing property or inheriting small sums, those rights were conditional, always subject to male interpretation and local bias. A widow who acted too freely could quickly become the subject of suspicion, especially if she declined marriage offers or was seen speaking comfortably with younger men. You remember hearing of a case some years ago in a nearby village where a widow refused a local merchant's proposal. 2 weeks later, his cows fell ill, and suddenly it was whispered that her unsettled grief had cursed the livestock. No evidence, no confrontation, just rumors spreading like mildew on damp stone. One strange tidbit preserved in a 15th century Swiss town record describes a woman who was accused of causing a neighbor's bread to spoil. Why? Because she walked by his oven 3 times in one afternoon after he had publicly scolded her. The town elders called her agitated. That was enough. You pass by the widow's gate, now pretending not to look. She's in her garden, kneeling in the soil hands stained with time and earth. Her sleeves are rolled up, her jaw set. She looks strong, but you wonder what that strength costs her. Each confident movement, each moment alone, is an invitation for admiration, yes, but also for envy, for fear. Historians still discuss the contradictory role of widows in medieval Europe. On one hand, they were feared for their freedom, envied for their knowledge, and suspected of witchcraft, if they acted beyond their expected mourning role. On the other, They were among the few women who could legally own property fund churches, or arrange marriages, often holding quiet power behind the scenes. The tension, it seems, was in their visibility. If they stayed silent, small, and sorrowful, they were left alone. But if they stood out through laughter, education, or confidence, they were marked. You recall your grandmother's words passed like a prayer. Never be the first to speak in a room where you are the only woman. She had lost 2 husbands and raised 5 children alone. You never thought of her as afraid, but now you wonder if fear was simply her language of caution. You hear the voices rise again by the well sharper now. Someone mentions that the widow had red berries in her basket yesterday out of season. Someone else remembers she once cured a neighbor's cough with tea instead of prayer. A third woman says she saw a raven land on the widow's roof this morning. The tone shifts from curiosity to calculation. It's beginning. The widow stands now, wiping her hands on her apron. She nods at you as you pass. You nod back, nothing more. Anything warmer might link you to her, might spark your name into their game of suspicion. Here, kindness is not always safe. Solidarity is a quiet thing and riskier still. You turn a corner and find the baker's daughter speaking in hushed tones to a friend. She's describing how the widow once looked straight into the eyes of a visiting friar. Not like she was ashamed, she says wide-eyed. Her friend gasps softly. You feel the narrative tightening bit by bit like a drawstring on a purse. In many towns during the early and high medieval periods, accusations didn't require evidence. Suspicion could build slowly with whispers and glances until it reached a tipping point. A woman who was too much, too pretty, too sharp, too alone could find herself isolated, questioned, and in some cases formally charged with moral or spiritual offenses. One recorded event in 14th century Burgundy details a widow accused of stirring improper thoughts in local men simply because she refused to wear mourning black after the first year of her husband's death. Though she denied all allegations, the local clergy urged her to attend public penance barefoot and veiled before being welcomed back into proper society. You wonder what stories will be told about today's widow, and who will tell them. Perhaps the girl at the well. Perhaps the boy who offered to carry her basket last week. Perhaps no one. Or perhaps all of them speaking together in low voices while the facts dissolve into fables. You return home before sunset, careful not to glance back. In this place, looking can be interpreted as knowing, and knowing too much is never safe. As the evening settles in, you light a single candle and watch its flame waver in the draught. You think of her kneeling in her garden sleeves, rolled heart exposed, and you wonder how many other women have stood where she stands now, alone but not powerless, surrounded but not yet condemned. And you realize something simple, something sharp. A woman without a man is not a mystery. She is a mirror, and some people don't like what they see reflected back. By the next morning, the village has changed its rhythm. It's subtle, but you feel it. A shift in posture and pace in the way conversations thin out as you draw near. The well is less crowded. The baker's wife does not wave today. Someone has swept the cobblestones in front of your door, but left behind a small bundle of dried sage. A charm, perhaps, or a warning, or both. You walk uphill toward the edge of the settlement, where the trees grow thicker and the air smells more of bark than bread. There's a cottage there, small, slanted, older than most. Its shutters are patched with twine, and rosemary hangs like a curtain from the eaves. This is where she lives, the woman people avoid, the one they visit only when they must. She's outside, already crouched among the thistles, plucking something from the soil. You pause at a distance, but she doesn't look up. She doesn't need to. She already knows you're there. She always knows. No one calls her healer anymore. That word has gone out of fashion here. They say the old woman or her, or sometimes just let silence fill the space. But when a baby cries too long, or a man's cough deepens, or a young girl faints during fasting, Someone always finds their way to her door. She doesn't smile when she sees you. She doesn't need to. She gestures for you to sit beside her on a flat stone that still holds a bit of morning warmth. You do. Your skirt rustles. A bee buzzes nearby. For a moment there is no sound but the wind and the dry rasp of leaves. She speaks slowly, naming the herbs in her basket fennel, for the belly thyme, for the lungs marjoram, for dreams. Her hands are steady, her voice low. She does not explain what they do for women. She assumes you know, or that you will soon enough. Historically, women like her existed in nearly every European village. They were not physicians. They didn't have Latin diplomas or access to monastic libraries, but they carried knowledge in their fingers, their noses, their memories. They knew how to ease pain with warmth, how to bring on or delay a bleeding, how to quiet the body when it had been stirred too hard. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter, or learned through long apprenticeship, was often the only health care most people ever received. But the church did not like them. In many places the line between midwife and witch was paper thin, and worse still, these women were not just suspected of dangerous knowledge, they were feared for their independence. They lived alone, often childless, sometimes widowed. They spoke plainly. They didn't kneel when they didn't have to. And they knew things no man could explain. You recall a record from 14th century Germany where a woman named Alsa was accused of sorcery after a nobleman's wife miscarried. Alsa had given her a tea made of crushed juniper and angelica root, common ingredients today. But when the child was lost, the blame came quickly. The notes from her trial state. She said she was called to help, but we believe she called the trouble herself. No evidence, just grief and fear and the easy convenience of blame. The woman beside you wipes her hands on her apron and leans back, bones cracking gently. "Don't speak unless you must," she murmurs almost to herself. "But listen, always listen. It'll keep you breathing longer." You nod. Not because you understand fully, but because the air around her insists on agreement. Historians still debate the true role and influence of female herbalists in medieval life. Some argue they were central trusted figures, especially among women. Others suggest their position was always unstable, their safety conditional on usefulness. The moment someone fell ill after seeing them, they could become pariahs. You remember another story, this one told in whispers during your childhood, of a healer named Breda, who was called to ease the pains of a dying priest. She gave him syrup of poppy and rubbed his chest with vinegar and crushed mint. He passed quietly in the night. The next morning someone accused her of inviting the devil into the room. She was driven from town before sunset. One quirky detail found in a 15th century Welsh text lists certain signs to watch for in a suspicious woman: if she walks with bare feet in spring, if she speaks to crows, or if she gathers herbs by moonlight. You've done 2 of those things this month. You imagine many others have too. The woman beside you stands now, stretching slowly. She offers you a small bundle sage mint and something you don't recognize. "For clarity," she says. Then she turns back to her soil, her shadows, her silent power. As you walk back down the hill, the village seems smaller than before, less solid, more brittle. You glance back only once, just in time to see her light a small fire. The smoke curls upward, lavender, you think, or wormwood, something to cleanse, something to guard. You pass the chapel, where 2 women sweep the front steps and murmur to one another. You pass the market, where the butcher's wife casts a sideways glance. You walk steadily, basket at your hip shawl pulled close. You feel them watching, not you exactly, but the idea of you. And perhaps that is worse. Because once you've spoken to the woman on the hill, once you've accepted her bundle, once you've sat on the stone that remembers too much, you are no longer entirely safe. You are marked, not by sin, not by scandal, but by association with someone who knows too much, You tuck the herbs deeper into your apron pocket and keep walking. Not quickly, not nervously, but with the quiet care of someone who now sees where the cracks lie beneath the cobblestones. The convent sits at the far edge of the village beyond a narrow stream and a row of skeletal trees. Its walls are higher than they need to be, and its windows are narrow, more slits than openings. It looks peaceful from the outside, clean, orderly. But as you cross the wooden footbridge and feel the air shift colder, quieter, you realize peace is not the same as comfort. Some silences are chosen. Others are imposed. You've only been here a few times. Once to deliver herbs. Once to help repair a frayed hem on a novice's cloak. And once long ago to carry in a sick relative who was never seen again. The nuns had taken her gently, firmly, and that was that. Today you enter through the side gate where visitors are permitted. The garden smells of stone and rosemary. A few of the sisters move between rows of winter vegetables, their heads bowed, their steps measured. They don't speak unless spoken to, and even then only in whispers. Inside, a chill clings to the air. The stone corridors are bare except for a few faded tapestries and hand-woven mats. A young nun guides you to the scriptorium, where parchment stretches like pale skin across wooden desks. Candles gutter in iron sconces. Ink bottles line the tables like tiny sentries. This is where the records live. She hands you a small sheaf, old confessions copied and recopied through the years. Not the grand sins of war or theft, but the quieter, more troubling ones. You read slowly, lips barely moving. I dreamed of him again. He smiled and my knees grew soft. I saw the boy from the stable and felt a stirring in my chest. I recited psalms until it passed. I touched my own wrist for too long. I feared I had tempted something. You stop. Not because you're shocked, but because you're not. Historically, convents in the Middle Ages were paradoxical spaces. On one hand, they offered women education, shelter, and escape from forced marriage. On the other, they imposed strict spiritual disciplines, especially around emotion and the body. Nuns were expected to embody divine purity. Yet within those walls they remained human, longing, remembering, sometimes desiring, sometimes regretting. In many European abbeys, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, nuns kept personal journals, sometimes disguised as prayer books, in which they recorded feelings they could not speak aloud. These writings were not always romantic or rebellious. Often they were aching confessions of loneliness, confusion, or internal conflict between faith and flesh. One preserved manuscript from a Burgundian convent includes a passage where a nun writes of feeling wrapped in warmth after seeing sunlight on a young monk's face. She calls it a test of humility, though her tone is tender. The text ends with a prayer not for forgiveness, but for clarity. The debate continues among historians, were these feelings suppressed or accepted quietly within the convent. Some suggest that elder nuns counseled younger sisters through these emotional storms, treating them as natural parts of spiritual growth. Others argue that any expression of desire, no matter how mild, was met with shame, punishment, or additional penance. You turn the last page and find a name scratched out. The ink is darker, newer. Someone removed it purposefully. You wonder what she wrote, or what she did, or who decided she should be erased. The young nun beside you clears her throat and offers a wooden box. Inside are scraps of parchment worn at the edges. Notes, fragments. Some have faded entirely. Others still whisper. One reads simply, "He made me feel real. I prayed to forget." Another says, "It is not sin to long. It is sin to be seen longing." You fold the pages, gently returning them to the box. As you do, you catch sight of a tiny embroidery on the hem of the nun's sleeve. A single thread of pale pink among the white. You wonder if it was stitched by her own hand. A hidden rebellion or a silent prayer. There's a tidbit tucked in a 14th century Venetian convent record, about a novice who embroidered rose petals onto her underrobe. When asked why she claimed it was to remember that flowers bloom even in silence, the prioress made her unpick the thread, then asked her to fast for 7 days. No other punishment was recorded. You walk slowly through the cloister, the floor cold beneath your shoes. In the chapel, a few sisters kneel in silent prayer. Their bodies sway slightly like reeds in still water. One raises her eyes for a moment and meets yours. She doesn't smile, but her gaze holds you there, steady and knowing, as if she sees something in you, or recognizes it. You sit on the farthest bench and let the silence settle over you. It's not the absence of noise, it's the presence of restraint, the weight of all the things not said, the feelings not named, the dreams not admitted. You wonder how many confessions have been made in this room, how many truths turned into sins, simply because they were felt by women. The soft warmth of a glance, the flutter in the chest, the shiver in solitude, none of it harmful, all of it suspect. You think again of the records, the ones you read, and the ones that were hidden, torn, burned, or never written at all. The voices of women who didn't want to defy God, only to feel something and still be good. The bell rings long and low. Evening prayers. You slip out before the candles are lit. Outside, the garden glows faintly in the dusk. You breathe in the scent of mint and soil. And as you cross back over the stream, you realize the convent does not kill desire. It only teaches women to fold it inward, to tuck it under layers of obedience, to rename it. But even renamed it remains soft, persistent, human. You leave the convent as the sky begins to bruise into twilight. The wind picks up as you cross the ridge back toward the heart of the village, but you do not return home, not yet. Instead, your feet follow the old path that skirts the chapel and curves behind the smithy down to a square most have forgotten. It isn't marked on maps. Children are warned away. Even the dogs hesitate here. And yet some nights like this one it calls. You step into the clearing just as the sun disappears. Stones rim the space in a rough circle. A low wall remains on one side, crumbling, overtaken by moss and thorn. This was once the place of reckoning, punishment, exposure, silence made visible. You run your fingers over a jagged groove in the stone. A name might have been there once. Now only lichen. Earth swallows what memory cannot hold. Long ago, when someone was judged to have overstepped her role, too loud, too free, too knowing she was brought here. Not for trial. That part had already happened behind closed doors. This was for spectacle and correction. A woman might be locked in a pillory, her head and hands exposed to the weather, to passers-by, to whatever words or objects were thrown. Her shame was meant to cleanse the village, her silence to restore order. Some were accused of speaking out against the priest, some of encouraging desire through glance or gesture, some simply for being seen with the wrong man or alone too often. Others, it was whispered, had touched the edges of knowledge they weren't supposed to possess. How to ease birth, how to understand the body, how to read a text not meant for them. You crouch beside one of the old posts, its wood long rotted but still rooted in the ground. You imagine the rope that bruises the cold. You imagine trying to stand still while the world throws its judgment at you. Not for what you did, but for what they believed about you. One recorded punishment from 13th century France describes a woman who was forced to walk the square barefoot, with a sign hung around her neck, reading Temptress, her crime singing while drawing water. The official decree said she had provoked thoughts inappropriate for pious men. No one remembered the song, only the punishment. You remember another. In a Florentine record, a woman was made to stand in silence at the church doors each morning for 30 days, holding a stone in her hands. The priest called it a penance for prideful laughter. The record notes that her hands bled. Nothing is said about whether she laughed again. But perhaps the most chilling thing is not the cruelty, but the erasure, So many names gone, so many records burned or altered. What remains are fragments, a stain on the parish wall, a line in a ledger, a folk song that hints at loss but names no one. Because silence was not just the punishment, it was the method, the outcome, the legacy. Even now as you stand here, you realize how deeply that silence runs. No one speaks of this place, but every woman in the village knows not to walk here after dark. Every girl learns the lesson without the words, be small, be quiet, be forgettable. You hear the wind shift, and for a moment it sounds like weeping, but it's only the branches overhead clattering like old bones. A quirky historical detail survives in a medieval English manuscript. A charm stitched into the hem of a woman's cloak was believed to prevent public humiliation. It read, "Speak soft walk, light vanish bright." No one knows if it worked. But the stitching was found in 3 different burial shrouds from the period. Historians still debate whether public punishments like this were more symbolic than systemic. Some argue they were rare, designed for spectacle and deterrence. Others believe they were more common than the records suggest, just underreported unremarked, because they were so ordinary. You take a step back from the stone and exhale. The air smells faintly of ash. Somewhere beneath your feet is a memory no one will claim. But the earth remembers. It always does. You walk home in the dark slower than before. The wind wraps around you like a second shawl. You think of the convent and the garden, the cloistered dreams and whispered regrets. You think of the woman on the hill with her herbs, her fire. You think of the songs and the silences, and you realize none of it was separate. Desire, knowledge, voice, each one when found in a woman became dangerous, not because of what they were, but because of what they represented: agency, imagination, presence, and so they were hidden, punished, or erased, but not completely. You reach your door, hand on the latch. The moon has risen pale and watchful. You look back just once toward the square. The trees move in shadow. You whisper not a prayer, but a promise. You are still here. By morning, the market has returned to its noise, fishmongers shouting across crates of herring wool traders, arguing over dye lots, a baker's child chasing hens with sticky fingers. But as you step between the stalls, you notice something else moving just beneath the clamor. A tune. It starts as a hum, low, uncertain. Then another voice picks it up, and another. Soon the melody wraps around the crowd like a shawl. Old women mouth the words. Children giggle at the rhyme. Men pretend not to notice, but their shoulders sway just slightly with the beat. It's just a song. Nothing serious, nothing to be worried about, except that you know better. These verses, these innocent-sounding riddles and lullabies, are where truth hides when truth isn't safe. They're handed down like recipes, whispered between sisters, woven into spinning songs or harvest chants. No one claims to write them. No one admits to starting them. But somehow everyone knows them. You pass a stall selling onions and hear an older woman sing beneath her breath. Her cheeks were red, her ribbon torn. He said, "Repent." She laughed till morn. You pause. No one reacts. But in the rhythm, in the cadence, there's something sharper than rhyme. A memory, a lesson. Folk music in the medieval world, particularly among women, often served as a repository for shared experiences that couldn't be recorded in formal histories. In regions from the British Isles to the Low Countries, women sang while they worked lyrics that sounded innocent, but carried deep commentary on love control, betrayal, and endurance. Some scholars refer to these as counter-sermons, oral counter-narratives, to the official moral instruction of the pulpit. One preserved Dutch folk ballad from the 14th century tells of a girl who outwits a priest's advances by pretending to be possessed by a saint. The humor is dark, but the message is clear. Cleverness can be its own kind of shield. You stop to buy apples from a girl whose eyes are sharp beyond her years. She offers you one with a smile and a few lines from a song you recognize. He said, "Be good." She said, "Define it." He said, "Be still." She said, "Try silence." There's laughter in her voice. Not defiance exactly. Something older, wiser. Tidbits like these appear in manuscripts and marginalia throughout medieval Europe. Notes scribbled in church books. Tiny lyrics wedged between sermons. Decorative borders that curve into dancing women. Monks sometimes scrawled commentary in the margins, mocking these lines, calling them idle fancies. But they copied them all the same. Historians still debate the intent. Were these songs acts of rebellion or just relief? Some say they were catharsis-safe ways to voice what couldn't be spoken. Others argue they held coded protest, especially when they spread rapidly across regions without attribution. No author, no origin, just voices echoing what was felt too deeply to remain silent. As you leave the market, the tune still clings to your ear. You find yourself humming without realizing it. The rhythm feels like footsteps, like heartbeat, like breath. And in that moment you see it, the network, the hidden map, mothers, daughters, widows, nuns, merchants passing on stories through thread and note and glance. Not written on parchment, not sanctioned by any council, but lasting all the same. You walk past a stone wall where someone has carved a single word, listen. No name, no date, but it's enough. And now, as the path turns once more toward open road, the world of the village begins to blur behind you. But its echoes carry forward. Because silence, you realize, was never truly empty. It was full of music, full of meaning, full of the words they weren't allowed to say, tucked between lines, hidden in rhyme, stitched into sleeves, carried in apples, spoken in gardens, and sung beneath breath. And perhaps that was enough. The wind rises softly now, pulling at your cloak. It's time to go further, beyond this village, beyond this land, to see how other women across seas and centuries found their own ways to endure, to express, to protect what they could not name. Their stories wait beyond the next hill. The moment you cross into the inner court, everything narrows. The corridors feel thinner, the voices lower. The very air hushes itself, as if it too understands that in this part of the palace, even silence has rules. You no longer carry the weight of your old name. Instead, you're just a number in the long line of women called Gungyo court ladies of Joseon. You are not a daughter, not a sister, and certainly not someone's beloved. You are an extension of the palace itself, folded into its structure like stone in the wall or stitch in a robe. This is the 15th century royal court of the Joseon dynasty, and you have just begun your life in the inner court Nejon, where the king's mother queen concubines and all the women who serve them reside. Every gesture here carries meaning, and every look can be read like a book. But you are not allowed to write your own. You were selected young, perhaps even before your 10th year, chosen by local officials for your clear skin or your steady hands. Your parents bowed low, grateful for the honor, though they knew it meant you would never return, not truly. Upon arrival at the palace, your life became one of rigid order. You sleep in a shared dormitory, your mat aligned precisely with the others. You rise before the birds dress in muted tones and recite palace rules before breakfast. Even how you hold your hands one atop the other, fingers aligned, has been taught and corrected. You work not for silver or praise, but for duty. Each day might bring a different assignment. You may fold and arrange the queen's wardrobe sweep shrines, stir medicinal herbs, or chant Buddhist prayers in the stillness before dawn. Your tasks are not just chores. They are demonstrations of submission and grace. You are taught that emotion is dangerous, especially your own. If something stirs in your heart, if a passing glance warms your cheeks, or a melody draws tears, you press it down like a loose thread under a well-tucked hem. The philosophy of the time Neo-Confucianism permeates every moment of your day. It praises restraint and hierarchy, elevating obedience above feeling. Women, especially those in the palace, are expected to embody Yol, the ideal of virtuous womanhood. A Gungyo must be invisible in desire, inaudible in opinion, and untouchable by the stirrings of affection. Even friendships are policed. Too much laughter, too much closeness, and eyebrows will rise. You remember once seeing another Gungyo, a quiet girl with fingers as nimble as a silkworm, smile a little too long at a visiting official. The next morning she was reassigned to the laundry quarters. No explanation was given, but everyone understood. Even your voice is not quite your own. It may be used if it suits the palace's needs. One of the quirkiest customs here is how court ladies were sometimes chosen for roles based on the tone of their voice. If your words came out lilting and sweet, you might be tasked with singing ritual chants for the royal household. If your pronunciation was crisp and firm, you might be trained to read letters aloud to the queen. But you never speak on your own behalf. And yet beneath the layers of rules, something still stirs. Because you're not the first to feel it, that quiet ache of wanting to be seen, not just as efficient hands, but as a full person. There are stories that swirl through the halls like incense smoke. The tale of Yang Noksu, for example. Once a Giseng, she entered the court as a musician, and through her intelligence and artistry became a favored consort of King Yonsangan. She wielded enormous influence, too much, some whispered. In time, she became a warning more than a memory. Her fate, executed in a political coup, was told to you not with sorrow, but as a cautionary tale. Too much charm, too much ambition, too much woman. Still, you remember her name. You remember it late at night, when the dormitory falls quiet, and only the crackle of oil lamps keeps time. That's when the Gungyo around you become their fullest selves, not through shouting, but in stolen murmurs. One might pass a folded square of silk to another, who opens it to find a pressed flower or a line from a poem. Another quietly hums a tune that no one taught her. It's not part of the rituals, but it's hers. You listen. You begin to see what lives beneath the rules. A shadow language of longing and quiet resistance. You learn ways to speak without words. Some court ladies, it is said, wrote tiny poems on scraps of cloth, or inside the paper rolls used to wrap thread. These would be smuggled out of the palace, hidden in deliveries of textiles, or passed to fabric merchants who were too polite to look too closely. The poetry never used names. It didn't dare speak plainly. But you could hear the heartbeat in the metaphor. One verse, half remembered by an older Gungyo, still lingers in your mind. Thread winds tighter when hands remember warmth. But it will not tear, not yet. Even the palace architecture encourages silence. Doors slide instead of creaking. Footsteps are muffled by polished floors and woven mats. There are no loud declarations. No doors slammed in passion. Love, if it appears at all, must wear the quietest shoes. And yet the danger of even imagined affection hangs in the air. You've seen it before. When the crown prince once visited the inner court on an official errand, all of you were instructed to keep your heads bowed so low, your foreheads touched your folded hands. You were told not to move until he passed. And when a younger girl flinched, just slightly startled by a sparrow taking off from the courtyard, she was reprimanded harshly, though she hadn't even raised her eyes. Historians today still debate what kind of lives court women truly lived. Some argue that Gungyo held relatively secure positions. They were fed, clothed, educated, and sometimes even influential behind closed doors. Others say the security was a gilded cage. They point to the strict surveillance, the inability to marry, and the way even death could not free them without permission. When a court lady passed away, her funeral rituals had to be approved by superiors. There was no guarantee her family would be allowed to mourn her properly. In the memoir of Lady Higyeong, wife of Crown Prince Sado, you glimpse another layer of this world. She writes not only of ceremonies and court politics, but also of her personal grief of watching women suffer in silence, of how the appearance of order often hid profound fear and sorrow. In one passage, she describes her struggle to maintain dignity, while knowing that kindness could be interpreted as weakness and emotion as failure, and yet that inner voice, hers, yours, continues to whisper. Even now, as you walk through the corridor that connects the Queen's residence to the ancestral shrine, the moonlight dances along the papered windows. You pause to look out. There is a tree in the courtyard, whose blossoms you've watched every year but never been allowed to touch. Its petals are pale and brave, blooming even in cold wind. You envy it, but you also carry something stronger. Not rebellion exactly, but memory persistence, something that the rules can't quite name or silence. You've folded thousands of robes, swept hundreds of stairs, and bowed until your back ached. But in quiet moments, you've also composed verses in your mind. Simple ones, gentle ones. They're not meant for anyone else to hear, but they exist, and that matters. A line you think of often. The bird sings once, then hides in the eaves. But the echo lingers longer than the wings. Tonight, as the stars blink behind wisps of cloud, and the halls settle into nighttime calm, you find yourself lighting incense at the edge of the Queen's chamber. The smoke curls upward like a secret. You breathe slowly, deeply, as if inhaling the dreams of every woman who stood here before you. You do not speak. You do not write. But you are not empty. You are still here. You live in the warmth of shared tea and the hush of a doorway curtain in the threads passed hand to hand. You are the message that never needed paper, the emotion that never needed approval. And tomorrow you will wake again before dawn. Your robe will be pressed, your steps measured, but your thoughts, they will continue tucked inside the rhythm of daily duty, unspoken but alive. The incense is still in your sleeves. It clings faintly to the fabric as you step quietly out of the Joseon Palace memory, carrying not just the weight of routine, but the trace of every woman who bent her desires into silence. Yet before the smell can fade, you find yourself in another world, entirely more perfumed, more poetic, and yet in its own way just as watchful. It is spring in Tang Dynasty China, a time when the air is swollen with blossoms and suspicion, when even the silk screens that separate rooms seem to listen. You are not in a palace, but in the opulent home of a minor scholar official in Chang'an, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities on earth. You are not a wife, nor even a servant. You are his concubine, or to be more precise, one of them. Your role is clear but complex. You are part of the household, yet not part of the lineage. You sit behind the wife at banquet's bow when she enters, and never use her teacups. You are addressed with politeness but never affection. You exist somewhere between luxury and invisibility, surrounded by carved screens, lacquered floors, and boundaries too subtle to speak aloud. Still there is beauty here, the kind that almost distracts you. The gardens are meticulous shaped with the same care as court calligraphy. Peach blossoms scatter across the stepping stones, and the bamboo grove hums softly in the breeze. You spend long hours practicing the guqin zither of 7 strings, letting your fingertips dance across the notes like birds skimming water. When you strike the right chord, the very room seems to pause as if listening with you. That's how you first caught his attention. He heard you playing on a humid morning when the mist hadn't yet left the eaves, and for a moment, just long enough to glance up from his scroll, he noticed something in the melody. A softness, a question, a hope. It is not enough to change your place in the household. You are still secondary, but you are noticed, and that is both a balm and a blade. The Tang Dynasty, for all its dazzling art and openness, still builds its social world on Confucian roots. Women may be poets and musicians, but they are rarely decision makers. You have more freedoms than a Joseon court lady, more movement, more privacy, but there is still an invisible line between expression and transgression. You may write verses of longing, but only if no one believes they're about anyone real. And so you write. On rice paper trimmed with gold flecks, you sketch small poems that breathe more than they speak. Your handwriting is careful, almost too careful. You never use names. You refer to yourself as the bamboo reed or the autumn shadow. You say a noble sleeve brushed past instead of he touched my hand. It's not just style, it's survival. One of your favorites reads, "Between the screen and the lantern's glow, a breeze stirs not mine to chase." His shadow passed. I did not bow, but my sleeve trembled in its place. It's subtle enough that even the scholar's wife might mistake it for seasonal reflection, and yet a fellow concubine might read the heartbeat beneath it. These poems are your quiet rebellion, your whispered proof that you are still more than a pleasant silhouette. Historical records from the Tang period reveal a curious duality. On one hand, women during this era had more freedom than in many other Chinese dynasties. Some owned property. Others ran businesses. There were even empresses and high-ranking female officials. The most famous Wu Zetian rose from concubinage to become the only ruling empress in Chinese history. Yet at the personal level within homes like yours, the rules remained intricate and suffocating. A woman might be educated, even talented, but her value was still linked to her obedience, her fertility, and her ability to entertain without drawing attention. Poets like Yu Xuanji, a Taoist nun and former concubine, broke these rules just by writing openly about emotion. She was brilliant, daring, and executed under murky accusations centuries before her verses were rediscovered and honored. You think of Yu Xuanji often, not with the illusion that you could be her, but with the quiet ache of kinship. You too write about things no one wants to name. You too live behind a screen of silk of class of expectations. And yet the world here does bloom around you. In the spring, the household holds gatherings under lantern-lit canopies. The scholar invites friends, officials, painters, visiting monks, and you are summoned to play music while the guests sip plum wine. Your posture is practiced graceful, and your eyes remain modestly lowered, but your songs speak for you. One night, a visiting guest quietly leaves a folded slip of paper beneath your guqin. You find it later after everyone is asleep. It contains a single line of poetry she plays as if spring grieves through her fingers. You do not reply. You cannot, but you keep the note. Among the concubines there is a hierarchy unwritten, but felt. The younger ones compete in silence with clever hairpins and perfectly brewed teas. The older ones, like you, measure their strength in subtler ways. One, a woman known only as Lady Huo, once whispered to you how she hides her real poetry inside her prayers. "If it's written to the moon," she said with a wink, "no one dares question the subject." You begin to do the same. Even the household cat becomes your metaphor. In one poem you write, "She curls at the edge of the red rug, not meant to be seen, yet always there. She knows which steps bring warmth, and which bring only passing shadow." You pin this verse behind a scroll in your chamber. It is never meant for anyone else. And yet, like the cat, it watches. It waits. Historians still debate whether the Tang concubines had meaningful influence in the lives of their masters. Some records suggest they could sway decisions, soften moods, even save careers with a well-placed word or song. Others argue their position was always fragile, dependent on favor that could shift like wind. But what is certain is this: the poetry they left behind, sometimes anonymous, sometimes misattributed, still speaks. You live in that same suspended space. One morning, as you sit by the open lattice window, watching bees spiral lazily through jasmine flowers, you hear the scholar's voice from another room. He is dictating a letter to a clerk, and your name is not mentioned. You're not surprised. In this house you are present but not permanent. Still later that day, a maid informs you that you've been given new ink and brushes. A gift, she says. No reason offered. You say thank you. You bow. But that night you write with a little more boldness. You choose metaphors that almost sound like confession. You leave the scroll on your table half unrolled. By morning it's been taken. No one mentions it. No one says anything. But at that evening's gathering, the scholar requests a particular song. One you've only ever played in private. You play it again. Your fingers steady. Your heart louder. And as the zither hums beneath your hands, you know he remembers. You are not free. Not truly. But you are also not erased. You exist in silences and ink in glances across paper screens, in the invisible curve between duty and selfhood. You are not the wife. You will never be named matriarch. But your poems will outlive the tea sets and garden stones. Someone someday will find them, read them aloud, and wonder about the woman who hid them so well. And now, as the lanterns burn lower and the shadows stretch longer, you gather your tools once again. A brush, a scroll, a line you've whispered in your thoughts for days. You dip the brush in ink and begin to write, not for love, not for rebellion, not even for legacy, just for the feeling of being once again fully alive. The strings are still vibrating when you slip quietly away, not from the room, not from the memory, but from the skin of it, the hush of a guqin still clinging faintly to your fingers. You do not say goodbye to the scrolls or the garden. You carry them like scent, like a borrowed rhythm into a new corner of the world. This time the latticework becomes geometric. The air shifts, warm-dry, perfumed with citrus and cedar. You are in Al-Andalus, the jewel of Islamic Spain. The era is the 10th century, and though power belongs to the Caliphate of Cordoba, the women who matter most tonight are hidden just beyond the carved archways, where the mosaics shimmer like spilled honey. You are one of them, a poet, a singer, a whisperer behind the curtain. You live within the harem, though not as a consort. You are known as a Jawari, an enslaved woman, trained in music, literature, calligraphy, and philosophy. And while your status is precarious, your talent is your breath. You've been schooled not just in Quranic recitation, but in the lyrical traditions of Muwasha and Zajal, poetic forms that bend rules, slip beneath walls and bloom in secret gardens of meaning. Your performances are not public. They take place in private salons, majlis gatherings lit by low oil lamps framed by silken drapery. You sing behind screens, your face rarely seen by guests, but your voice has been known to halt conversation mid-sip. It's been called the sound that stirs jasmine, which you think is better than being called someone's property. You learned to sing before you knew how to write. You learned how to breathe between lines, how to linger on a note just long enough to make someone forget the words and remember only the ache. The muwasha is your specialty. This poetic form born in Al-Andalus often begins and ends with a short refrain in a vernacular dialect, al-Kharja sometimes even in the voices of women. Within its intricate structure, feelings can hide in plain sight. A verse may speak of spring rains, but it means desire. A line may mention the moon, but it means absence. You never write directly. That would be dangerous. One of your favorite Kharja fragments goes, "If he comes, tell him my sleep has fled since the night he passed my garden." No names, no blame, but the pulse is clear. In the women's quarters, the others often gather around you in the evenings. There is a rhythm to these hours. After the duties are done, after the call to prayer has faded into twilight, the younger ones ask for songs, real ones, not the versions sung before the men. They want the riddles, the unfiltered verses, the sighs between syllables. You oblige them gently. Some nights you compose on the spot, folding inside jokes into ancient melodies. One girl, Amina, once snorted mid-verse and tried to stifle it with her sleeve. That night's song became a poem about a gazelle who mocked a prince's perfume. They still whisper it under their breath when the eunuchs aren't listening. There's joy in this, but also danger. Officially, you belong to the caliph, but practically you are part of a network of women whose roles shift with each moon. Some are dancers, others musicians. A few are scholars in everything but name. They teach one another how to argue using metaphor, how to deflect attention with an extra layer of modesty, how to embed longing into structure so tight it squeaks. Historians still argue whether women in Al-Andalus had any agency at all. Some point to poets like Walida bint al-Mustakfi, daughter of a caliph who famously hosted salons and composed verses, as bold as any man's. Others argue she was the exception, not the rule. Most women, especially Jawari, remained subject to their patron's whims. But even within confinement there are corners. There is art. There is mischief. Your tidbit. You once heard of a woman in a neighboring palace who wrote love verses in saffron ink on rice paper, then folded them into almond pastries, meant for one particular court musician, who always lingered too long by the trays. No one ever proved it. But that musician played especially well that spring. You've never dared such things. But tonight something stirs. There is a guest in the house, a visiting scholar from Fez, known for his recitations and impossible memory. He's seated among the men now behind the partition. You've been asked to perform one of your older pieces, something graceful and modest. But instead you choose a newer song, one you've barely rehearsed. It begins with dew and ends with flame. As your voice threads through the room, you feel the shift, the hush, the slight tremor of stillness. You can't see their faces, but you know. Someone has heard the real meaning. Later that evening, as you return your instrument to its velvet-lined case, you find a note tucked inside. Your refrain lingers like mint on the tongue. Did you mean it? No signature, no seal. You burn it, not out of fear, but because you do mean it, and that's enough. The other women don't ask. They sense the change. That's the thing about your world. Words are traded in looks, secrets exchanged in phrasing. One concubine leaves a jasmine sprig on your pillow. Another braids your hair more delicately the next morning. These are acknowledgments. You are one of them. You all perform beauty. But beneath that you perform resistance. Even as you kneel, even as you serve tea, even as you play soft tunes that lull men into forgetting your minds, you are watching. You are remembering. You are making art. The structure of the muwasha becomes your armor. Where others see rhyme, you see refuge. You layer your verses like veils, and somewhere beneath them the truth remains untouched. In later centuries, scholars will dig through the surviving manuscripts from Al-Andalus and puzzle over the female voices in the Kajas. Were they real? Were they imagined by male poets? Why were they written in the language of commoners? They'll miss the point. The women weren't seeking to be remembered. They were seeking to feel, to know themselves in a world that pretended they didn't exist. That's why you write your next poem not on paper, but in your mind. You repeat it as you walk the shaded halls, as you brush your fingers across tiles cool with morning. You let it live in your breath just long enough to prove that you are not silent. You are singing, even when no one listens. The light shifts again. This time it comes not from filtered moonlight or carved latticework, but from the low orange flicker of a clay oven. The scent is smoky soft, comforting like flatbread baking at dawn. And just behind that scent, something more delicate ink. Old ink faded on brittle papyrus tucked beside a warm stone wall, where no one thinks to look. You are in Hellenistic Egypt, sometime after the conquest of Alexander the Great, but before Rome has truly sunk its teeth in. The city outside your courtyard bustles in 3 languages, Greek for business, Demotic for gossip, and a handful of fading whispers in Coptic, clinging to the edges of time. Here in the town of Oxyrhynchus, the past and the present coexist uneasily like guests from different worlds, trying not to touch elbows. You are a young woman of Greek descent, born into a middle-ranking household. Not poor, but not powerful either. Your father writes contracts for landowners. Your mother manages the servants. Your marriage has already been arranged, but the date keeps being pushed back first, because of a cousin's funeral, then because your betrothed is sent to Memphis on trade. You don't mind. You've learned to enjoy the pause, because in the quiet you've discovered something new. A letter, folded, careful, deliberate. Tucked behind an amphora in the kitchen, it bears your name in familiar handwriting, only not from your family. It's from her. She was your tutor's niece. She stayed only one season helping with your Greek declensions and your music lessons. She read Sappho to you once in the shade of the fig tree. She said the poet's name like it was a secret worth keeping. You never touched her hand. But you remember the softness of her voice when she corrected your verse meter. You remember how she said your name when you pronounced something almost right. Now she writes to you on coarse papyrus, the ink hurried and slightly smudged in one corner. My breath stops when I hear your name mentioned by others. I cannot say more here, but I hope you still sing the poem I marked for you. The one about the woman whose robe brushed against spring wheat. That one. You read it only once, then you burn it in the hearth before your mother returns. But your fingers remember it. You trace each word again in the air when no one's looking. Historians still debate whether women in Hellenistic Egypt had greater literacy than their counterparts in other ancient societies. The papyri suggest, yes, women wrote receipts, wills, personal letters. Some even held priestly roles or owned land. But the picture is fragmented like a broken amphora reassembled from mismatched shards. Most voices that survive are men's, and yet here and there women's ink remains. You begin to write letters too, not for sending, just for having. You hide them in scrolls in the lining of your kithara case in the hollow base of a clay jar. You don't sign them, but you pour yourself into them. The sky is warm today, the kind of warmth that feels like your laughter. When you pointed out the cracked tile by the doorway, I wore the blue robe again. I imagined you said it suited me. I imagined a great many things. You write in Greek, of course. That's the language of learning. But you occasionally slip in a word from the old tongue, a name for the wind, a nickname from childhood. You imagine her reading those words and knowing instantly what you meant. There's a small side door near the kiln that no one uses. You begin leaving your letters there hidden in the crevice of a half-broken mortar stone. You tell yourself it's just a ritual. You know she's gone. You know no one will find them. But one day the mortar is moved, replaced. The crevice is sealed. You say nothing. But that night you don't write a letter. You take a clean scrap of papyrus and begin a new song instead. It starts slowly, awkwardly, like pressing your feet into unfamiliar sand. But the melody finds you curling gently around your thoughts. You hum it into your pillow. You do not burn it. There's a papyrus fragment found centuries later by archaeologists in Oxyrhynchus. It contains a short anonymous lyric. If the wind takes my hair from my braid, may she tuck it behind my ear. No one knows who wrote it. Some say it's a lost fragment from Sappho's imitators. Others say it was a woman, perhaps a servant, or a scribe composing something never meant for public ears. That's the thing about your time. The public is for the loud. The enduring is for the documented. But the real lives, the real feelings, they live in the margins. You begin to cook more often, not because you enjoy the heat, but because the warmth of the oven reminds you of that first letter. You bake flatbreads with herbs from the garden. You scald your fingers on ceramic rims, humming half-remembered lines from songs that never had names. There's a tidbit you once heard from an old kitchen maid, that some women in Alexandria used to mix rose oil with lamp soot to write invisible ink. It only became visible when warmed near a flame. You try it once. It works. You laugh alone in the storeroom, your fingers blackened your heart a little louder than before, but you don't use it again. Not because it's impractical, but because it's too much. Even invisible words leave traces. Years pass. You marry eventually. He's kind, quiet. You learn to enjoy the comfort of shared silence. But your music changes. Your songs take on different tones. You teach your daughters to read, and though you use official scrolls, you always slip in one or two of your own verses hidden in the middle. Riddles mostly. Lyrics about stars or rivers. But you know the meaning. You never tell them the whole story. But you watch their eyes when they hum your melodies, and you know the seed has taken root. Historians will later marvel at how many fragments survive from this region. They will name the discovery the treasure trove of Oxyrhynchus, and sift through poems, contracts, grocery lists, and love letters. Most won't have names. Most won't have endings. But that's all right. You don't need an ending. You've become part of the ink. And somewhere, maybe 100 years from now, a woman you've never met will hum your song in a room you've never seen. She won't know your name, but she'll feel it. She'll know what it means to write between the lines. The scent of papyrus fades, replaced now by steam-warm fragrant, clinging to your skin like memory. You tilt the copper kettle just slightly, and the water swirls over crushed chamomile rose petals and dried quince rind. The tea will need time to steep, but you don't mind. You've been trained to wait. You're no longer in the dust of Hellenistic Egypt, but in the cooler shadows of an Ottoman garden centuries later. The walls are whitewashed and high cloaking the courtyard in peace, but everything inside sings in color. Potted hyacinths bloom at the edge of the fountain. A date palm leans languidly near the bench where you sit with your mother. And from behind a vine-covered trellis, the lattice hums softly with wind and watching eyes. You are a concubine in training in the imperial palace, though that word concubine is never spoken aloud. Instead, they call you a Caden Adaya, a woman in formation. You were selected not by royalty, but by the steward of the harem school, brought here from the provinces after someone saw you dance at a village festival. You didn't know then that beauty could be a sentence. Each morning is ritual. You wake before the first prayer call, wash in silence, and fold your bed linens into precise squares. Lessons begin with Quranic verses, then Turkish poetry, Arabic grammar, and Ottoman court etiquette. By noon, you're back in the garden, under the shade of a fig tree with your mother. Not your birth mother. She is gone now. This woman, Nigar Khalfa, is your trainer, mentor, and protector all in one. She's lived in the palace 30 years and has never once stepped beyond the gates. Her voice is low, never rushed, and every afternoon without fail she prepares tea. Not with the standard palace blends, but with herbs. She crushes herself in a small brass mortar. This one, she says, handing you a steaming cup, calms the belly after grief. You learn that tea is not just drink, but code. She teaches you to read leaves not for fortune, but for signs an extra pinch of cinnamon, for courage 2 sprigs of mint, to signal a secret worth keeping. You're never told outright what you're being prepared for, but the palace speaks in undertones, and you're learning how to listen. Tidbit: among Ottoman palace women, it was common to pass knowledge not through books, but through herbs, embroidery patterns, and coded lullabies. A woman could sew her sadness into a hem, or steep it into a bitter brew. You remember the first time you steeped lavender and lemon verbena together, how the scent lingered on your fingertips, how Nigar Khalfa watched you without a word, and nodded once barely. That was also the day you received a robe, pale green silk with subtle embroidery. It means you're entering the next circle closer to the Sultan's court. No promises, of course. But the shift is clear. It terrifies you. The women who rise too fast often fall faster. You've heard stories. A girl who once laughed too freely was sent to Edirne for disciplinary training, and never returned. Another was caught crying at night. Nothing was said, but she began cleaning marble floors the next week, her silks replaced with coarse wool. So you stay quiet. You do not cry. You write your longings in invisible ink, your fingers steeping meaning into every blend you serve. One day, while organizing the spice racks in the palace kitchen, you find a packet, old yellowed, tied with silk thread. It contains dried saffron petals and a small scroll. You unroll it carefully. To long in silence is not weakness. To live unseen is not to be without fire. If the leaf is steeped long enough, even water remembers its color. There's no signature. You don't need one. You recognize the hand, delicate, deliberate, filled with restraint. You copy it down, commit it to memory, then burn the scroll and scatter the ashes in your next tea. Historians still debate whether the women of the Ottoman harem were oppressed prisoners or strategic political players. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in between. Some women, like Hürrem Sultan, rose from concubines to queens. Others faded without a trace, their lives recorded only in laundry lists and perfume inventories. You're not interested in being remembered, but you do wish to be understood just once fully without filter. Nigar Khalfa begins coughing more often. You brew her linden flower with cloves, but her voice weakens each week. One evening, just as the call to prayer echoes from the Blue Mosque, she hands you her mortar and says, "Add cinnamon," but only when it's safe to speak. She passes before spring. The palace is quiet for days. Your lessons continue, but something essential is missing. You go back to the garden, crush herbs in her mortar, and speak your secrets aloud to the leaves. One day, a younger girl asks you for tea to help her sleep. You prepare it silently, mint rosehip, a trace of lemon balm, and press the warm cup into her hands. She holds your gaze and nods. You have become her Nigar Khalfa. Without ceremony, without title, the torch is passed. A historical fact. Within the harem, many women were educated in astronomy, literature, and diplomacy. These were not idle ornaments. They were carefully groomed to interact with visiting dignitaries, manage palace logistics, and raise princes with imperial poise. And many did so behind veils not just of cloth, but of silence. You begin writing again. This time not letters, but recipes. Herbal codes passed as medicinal instructions. For the stomach, crushed fennel and honey. For the restless heart, 3 dried violets steeped by moonlight. You bind them into a small booklet and tuck it beneath a loose stone in the garden wall. You never tell anyone, but you notice weeks later that the stone has been moved. The booklet is still there, but a new recipe has been added in different handwriting. To remember even when forgetting is safer. Time crushed peach leaf and crushed rose stem. The garden is not yours, but the code is. Time passes. You remain in the palace long after your youth fades. You are not chosen by the Sultan, but you are chosen by other women girls who come to you with headaches, fears, questions they don't know how to ask. You answer in tea and flowers in the tilt of your eyebrow. You walk slower now and your hands tremble, but your voice still carries when you need it to. One evening, near the fountain, a servant asks you what it's like to have lived so long, without ever leaving the walls. You smile and say, not all roots grow in soil. Some take hold in memory. The evening call to prayer begins. You crush the last of your dried quince rind and pour the boiling water with steady hands. The garden smells of old summer's closed doors and things not said aloud. And beneath the scent of herbs and steam, something else entirely. Survival. The sun rises gently, and for the first time in what feels like 1,000 years, you let it touch your face without fear. The courtyard is empty now. No footsteps, no hushed voices, no embroidered slippers brushing against cold marble. Just you, the stones beneath your feet, and a silence that feels full rather than hollow. You step forward, careful not to disturb this quiet. Because here, silence is no longer a punishment. It is a memory, a monument, a breath held in reverence. You have walked through the shadows of centuries, through convents and cloisters, harems and palaces, marketplaces and back alleys, through script and song, tea and thread. You've stood beside women whose names were never written down, whose emotions were filtered through the lens of others, whose longing was treated as dangerous. You felt their hope curl beneath a gaze, their joy wilt behind a curtain, their desire turned into doctrine. But you've also felt their defiance. It was there in the fingers that tucked a verse into a bolt of cloth. It was there in the quiet rituals of brewing herbs, with layered meaning in the flicker of an eye beneath a veil in the slow turn of a head, when someone walked by. Defiance didn't always shout. Sometimes it breathed in subtle rhythms. Sometimes it was a lullaby disguised as scripture, or a smile hidden behind lowered lashes. The world feared women's desire not because it was destructive, but because it was powerful. And so it was silenced, again and again in different languages and lands. But what they didn't understand, what perhaps they still don't, is that desire doesn't disappear when it's buried. It tunnels deeper, takes root, spreads, and eventually it blooms where no one thought to look. Across dynasties, the rules changed, but the fear remained. In Joseon Korea, you couldn't even marry locked into a life of service until death. In Tang China, your poems could live only in the margins. In Al-Andalus, your voice had to echo behind screens. In Egypt, your letters blurred the line between longing and propriety. In the Ottoman palace, your tea held generations of coded wisdom. Every woman carried her own version of this weight, and yet every one of them found a way to carry it with grace. Historians still argue whether these hidden expressions count as resistance, whether poetry, embroidery, herbal rituals, and quiet glances shaped history. But you know the answer now. You've seen the lives stitched into the seams of forgotten robes. You've heard the yearning in songs that never made it into royal archives. You felt the presence of women who were told they had no place in the story, yet left fingerprints all over it. They survived in symbols, in the faded calligraphy of a diary found behind a brick wall, in the unfinished tapestry in a dusty convent, in the slightly too sweet scent of a tea blend passed down for generations, in lullabies that don't make sense until you're old enough to understand what they're really about. And now, as you stand here, they survive in you. You are the culmination of all those silences. You carry the thread that was never cut, only hidden. You've learned that silence isn't emptiness, it's a reservoir. And when it breaks, it doesn't shatter, it flows. It tells stories. It heals. Tidbit. In some regions of medieval Europe and the Middle East, it was believed that a woman who could write might be dangerous, especially if she wrote poetry. In response, some women disguised their poems as recipes or prayers. A fragment found in a 12th century manuscript in Al-Andalus was once catalogued as a medicinal recipe until a scholar realized it was actually a love poem written in code. And still the world resists listening. But you don't. You've listened for hours now. You've leaned into the hush and heard the heartbeat underneath. You've given time to stories that were never shouted, only whispered. And in doing so, you've done something radical. You've remembered. You've honored. You've made space. You might not remember every name or every detail by morning, but you'll remember how it felt to walk beside them, to sit in a courtyard with the ghosts of longing, to light a candle where someone else once prayed for strength. That's what memory is. It's not perfection. It's presence. So as you turn to leave this world behind, as the light grows stronger, don't think of it as leaving. Think of it as carrying. Because you will carry this with you. In your breath, in your dreams, in your silences, in the way you notice someone walking a little too quickly or smiling a little too carefully, or pausing before speaking a thought that might be too much. You will know, and in that knowing something continues. And now here we are at the end of a long, quiet journey. If your eyes are heavy, that's all right. Let them close gently. There's no need to hold on tightly. The stories will stay with you even as sleep begins to take their place. You've wandered through ancient courtyards and secret libraries. You've read invisible poems, sipped metaphorical teas, and followed the threads left behind by women history nearly forgot. And all the while you listened. You paid attention. That alone is an act of kindness, a kind of resistance. The stories we told tonight weren't loud or grand. They didn't end with kings or battles, but they mattered, because the quiet lives, the ones often skipped over, are the ones closest to us. They remind us that survival doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a whisper passed down a glance, held a second too long a feeling never named, but never lost. So sleep now. Let your body rest and your thoughts drift. Let the candles in those ancient rooms dim one by one. Let the silk curtains sway gently in a dream only you can see. They would have wanted that. To know their stories found a listener. To know someone remembered. To know that in the end their silence was never truly empty. It was full of everything that had no safe place to be spoken. Good night. You are safe. End of script. Sweet dreams. The sun rises gently, and for the first time in what feels like 1,000 years, you let it touch your face without fear. The courtyard is empty now. No footsteps, no hushed voices, no embroidered slippers brushing against cold marble. Just you, the stones beneath your feet, and a silence that feels full rather than hollow. You step forward, careful not to disturb this quiet. Because here, silence is no longer a punishment. It is a memory, a monument, a breath held in reverence. You have walked through the shadows of centuries, through convents and cloisters, harems and palaces, marketplaces and back alleys, through script and song, tea and thread. You've stood beside women whose names were never written down, whose emotions were filtered through the lens of others, whose longing was treated as dangerous. You felt their hope curl beneath a gaze, their joy wilt behind a curtain, their desire turned into doctrine. But you've also felt their defiance. It was there in the fingers that tucked a verse into a bolt of cloth. It was there in the quiet rituals of brewing herbs, with layered meaning in the flicker of an eye beneath a veil in the slow turn of a head, when someone walked by. Defiance didn't always shout. Sometimes it breathed in subtle rhythms. Sometimes it was a lullaby disguised as scripture, or a smile hidden behind lowered lashes. The world feared women's desire not because it was destructive, but because it was powerful. And so it was silenced, again and again in different languages and lands. But what they didn't understand, what perhaps they still don't, is that desire doesn't disappear when it's buried. It tunnels deeper, takes root, spreads. And eventually it blooms where no one thought to look. Across dynasties, the rules changed, but the fear remained. In Joseon Korea, you couldn't even marry locked into a life of service until death. In Tang China, your poems could live only in the margins. In Al-Andalus, your voice had to echo behind screens. In Egypt, your letters blurred the line between longing and propriety. In the Ottoman palace, your tea held generations of coded wisdom. Every woman carried her own version of this weight, and yet every one of them found a way to carry it with grace. Historians still argue whether these hidden expressions count as resistance, whether poetry, embroidery, herbal rituals, and quiet glances shaped history. But you know the answer now. You've seen the lives stitched into the seams of forgotten robes. You've heard the yearning in songs that never made it into royal archives. You felt the presence of women who were told they had no place in the story, yet left fingerprints all over it. They survived in symbols, in the faded calligraphy of a diary found behind a brick wall, in the unfinished tapestry in a dusty convent, in the slightly too sweet scent of a tea blend passed down for generations, in lullabies that don't make sense until you're old enough to understand what they're really about. And now, as you stand here, they survive in you. You are the culmination of all those silences. You carry the thread that was never cut, only hidden. You've learned that silence isn't emptiness, it's a reservoir. And when it breaks, it doesn't shatter, it flows. It tells stories. It heals. Tidbit. In some regions of medieval Europe and the Middle East, it was believed that a woman who could write might be dangerous, especially if she wrote poetry. In response, some women disguised their poems as recipes or prayers. A fragment found in a 12th century manuscript in Al-Andalus was once catalogued as a medicinal recipe until a scholar realized it was actually a love poem written in code. And still the world resists listening. But you don't. You've listened for hours now. You've leaned into the hush and heard the heartbeat underneath. You've given time to stories that were never shouted, only whispered. And in doing so, you've done something radical. You've remembered. You've honored. You've made space. You might not remember every name or every detail by morning, but you'll remember how it felt to walk beside them, to sit in a courtyard with the ghosts of longing, to light a candle where someone else once prayed for strength. That's what memory is. It's not perfection. It's presence. So as you turn to leave this world behind as the light grows stronger, don't think of it as leaving. Think of it as carrying. Because you will carry this with you. In your breath. In your dreams. In your silences. In the way you notice someone walking a little too quickly or smiling a little too carefully, or pausing before speaking a thought that might be too much. You will know. And in that knowing, something continues. And now here we are at the end of a long, quiet journey. If your eyes are heavy, that's all right. Let them close gently. There's no need to hold on tightly. The stories will stay with you even as sleep begins to take their place. You've wandered through ancient courtyards and secret libraries. You've read invisible poems, sipped metaphorical teas, and followed the threads left behind by women history nearly forgot. And all the while you listened. You paid attention. That alone is an act of kindness, a kind of resistance. The stories we told tonight weren't loud or grand. They didn't end with kings or battles, but they mattered. Because the quiet lives, the ones often skipped over, are the ones closest to us. They remind us that survival doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a whisper passed down a glance, held a second too long a feeling never named, but never lost. So sleep now. Let your body rest and your thoughts drift. Let the candles in those ancient rooms dim one by one. Let the silk curtains sway gently in a dream only you can see. They would have wanted that. To know their stories found a listener. To know someone remembered. To know that in the end their silence was never truly empty. It was full of everything that had no safe place to be spoken. Good night. You are safe. End of script. Sweet dreams.